I have been deceived, she said, and burst into tears. Fulk was greatly shocked. You see now that I must hasten away, he said. Doubtless this great catastrophe has occupied men's minds, and interfered to prevent a strict search, but now I have found you it is a folly to remain here. My rendezvous with Eimer is at the place, World's End. We will go to World's End at once. Eimer will be there, said Violet, brightening a little. Yes, Eimer will be there, said Fulk. That evening they paid the bill to the honor of the dragon. It was a very small one and reached the station in a fly. The same train that had taken Eimer to London took them also. They stayed that night at an hotel, and next afternoon travelled down to the little station nearest to World's End. Another fly took them to the outskirts of Berrywick village, and from thence they walked to the place. Violet's heart sank. It was dark, not a light in the window, not a sign of life, the doors were fast. They broke a pane of glass, and Fulk opened the window, got in, and unbolted one of the back doors. Fulk had taken the precaution to bring with him a few provisions, and had also bought the local paper the Barnum Chronicle and stuffed it in with the ham in the basket, for he was anxious to read about his cousin Lady Agnes' marriage. Violet made a fire, and got some tea. She had provided that. Where was Eimer? A strange night that at the place. Fulk felt safer now he was out of the city, but Violet had too vivid a memory of the past. In the very house where so many happy hours had been passed she was alone with a perfect stranger, or one who was a stranger but a little while before. And Eimer? Where could Eimer be, was the question she constantly asked. Fulk said, Eimer was doubtless at Belthrop, trying to find her. But Hannah Bond knows I started for Sturmingham, objected Violet. If Eimer should see her, and go back to Sturmingham. I must write to her, or will you? I will go and see her, said Fulk, certainly I will. But remember that I am in hiding, it must be at night. Wait till tomorrow night. Give Eimer that little time to come, then I will go. Hannah must come and live here with me, said Violet, musingly. I think I shall stay at the place till where is your newspaper? I burned it, said Fulk. I burned it helping you to light the fire. It was the truth, yet it was a lie. He had burned it, that Violet might not see something in it. Eimer was not at Belthrop. Eimer's name was in the paper. How shall I amuse you, said Violet. This is my home, I must amuse you. I will play to you one of the airs that Eimer likes. Poor Eimer, she added, half to herself. The gentle, melancholy music of Mendelssohn filled the room from the long unused piano. Poor Eimer, repeated Fulk to himself. Poor Eimer, indeed. 13. At 12 o'clock of the night before his wedding day, Mayor's basket was galloping, fast as his best thoroughbred could carry him, from Barnum Town to the Towers. Barely had he settled himself at his hotel to think over the coming day, than a message summoned him to return. It was a splendid night, warm, still, the sky full of stars, and a faint odor of the hawthorn blossom in the air. The thin mist that Lady Leicester had seen had descended into the hollows, and as Mayers rode through it, it reached to his saddlebow. The horse rushed on, hidden in the cloud that covered the earth, the rider sat above it. Far behind clattered the groom, who had fetched him in hot haste. Lady Leicester is lost. Such was his brief message, and not all Mayer's sharp questioning could elicit anything more, for the simple reason that nothing more was known. About 8 o'clock she had been seen to leave the house, and the servants took no particular notice of it, expecting her to return in a short time, as she usually did. As she usually did, this was the first time Mayers had heard of the nocturnal walks of his bride. It was a mystery to him, it angered him. A man of plots and stratagems, he was always more or less suspicious of others. An hour had passed, and Lady Leicester did not return. The guests, and they were numerous that night at the Towers, asked for her. The household still kept their mistress a secret, but two ventured out to seek her. They went to the well-known spot, They saw the oak trunk, they heard the roar of the river, but Lady Leicester was not there. An anxious consultation took place. Butler, footman, the upper servants held a whispered discussion. At last the gamekeeper was sent for. If Lady Leicester happened to see him, she would not be annoyed. If she met any of the others, and fancied they had been watching her, it would cost them their places. The guests were put off with various excuses. Time passed, the gamekeeper reported the park clear, and not a trace of Lady Agnes. The truth could no longer be concealed. The alarm and excitement among the wedding guests may easily be imagined. All the gentlemen at once put on their hats, and with lanterns and brandy flasks proceeded to search the park in every direction. A man was dispatched post-haste on the swiftest horse for the bridegroom. One gentleman rode with him to Barnum, woke up the police, and instructed them to be on the alert, but, if possible, to keep matters quiet. Especially they were to look out for the dog Dando, who was known to have accompanied Lady Agnes, but had not returned. Mayres reached the Towers about 1 in the morning. During his ride he had mastered his feelings, he had crushed down the superstitious presentiment which warned him that all was in vain. He had not felt so unusually nervous about this marriage for nothing. But he mastered himself. One of his maxims was never to regret the past, but to apply the mind with iron will to make the best of the present. He called the servants, naturally taking the lead, and made them tell him all they knew. Then for the first time Lady Agnes' strange visits to the pot became known, and at once the gloomiest forebodings filled the minds of the guests. She was drowned, she had fallen down the pot. The idea grew and grew, till it became the one belief. Mayres himself could not doubt it. It was a strange and solemn conclave they held, at that hour of the night, in the hall at the Towers, Mayres standing in the midst, his face pale but composed, the guests crowding round him, the servants coming up one by one to be examined. The great clock at the Towers tolled 2, and there stepped silently into the room a stranger, plainly dressed, but remarkably upright, with an air of authority, the superintendent of police from Barnum. A silence followed his entrance. He marked it, and said that he had brought drags to search the river. Was there a boat anywhere to be obtained? There was no boat. The Ise ran so swift and was so shallow at ordinary times, and lay so deep down between its banks, that no one cared to keep a boat. The nearest known was a little punt 4 miles down the river, where it enlarged into a small lake. A man was dispatched to borrow it, and pole it up the rapid stream. He could not reach the pot, work as hard as he might, under 3 hours. All the gentlemen and not a few of the ladies, too excited to sit quietly within, went with the superintendent across the park to the pot, and watched the drags used. The superintendent asked them to stand back a moment while he examined the ground round the mouth of the funnel. He did so carefully, the grass had left no mark of a footstep, there was not a trace of a struggle, not a scrap of dress hanging to a twig, or a broken ornament. Then the drags were dropped down the strange funnel into the roaring water, and under the quiet stars the wedding guests gathered in a circle, watching the police as they searched the cave in vain. Neither drag nor pole could detect anything at the bottom, the light of the strongest bull's-eye failed to show any trace that a body had fallen down that narrow crevice, no stones or earth recently dislodged, not a particle of dress or shawl here either. By this time the ladies were tired, and shivered in the early morning breeze. They retired, but the gentlemen, greatly excited, stayed and assisted to fish the river Ise downwards for miles. The body would surely be carried with the current, but no, not a trace. The bright sun of the glorious May morning found them still at the mournful task. This was the wedding morning. The thrushes burst into song, the cuckoo flew over with his merry cry, dewdrops glittered like gems upon the bushes, and the lovely May bloom scented the breeze. A wedding morn indeed, but where was the bride? More than one glanced for a moment from the turbid river up to the deep azure of the sky, and the natural thought that followed need not be described. They met the punt at last, but it was useless. The man who poled it up had kept a close lookout, nothing had floated by. "We shall not find it," said the superintendent, till the flood subsides. Even yet there was one hope as they walked sadly back to the towers. The dog Dando, where was he? It was reasonable to think that if Lady Leicester had fallen into the river, the dog would presently return to the towers. If he did not return, there was still hope that she had wandered in some other direction, or had met with an accident, sprained her ankle, or broken her leg in the woods, perhaps. This idea had occurred to the superintendent and to Mares long before, and the gamekeeper, with 8 or 10 willing assistants, had been searching the woods for hours. As they neared the towers, it was obvious from the group of people talking excitedly before the entrance that something had happened. A policeman came towards them, leading Dando in a leash. He had but just arrived in a trap from Barnum town. Questions poured out from 100 lips. It was difficult to get an explanation, but it was understood at last. The superintendent on leaving Barnum had not omitted to warn the men on their heats in the town to look out for a dog, Lady Leicester's well-known dog, merely as a forlorn hope, never dreaming that Dando would wander thither. But a little after sunrise, perhaps about 6 o'clock, the dog Dando walked up the high street of Barnum behind a man wearing a grey suit, who knocked at the door of Mr. Broughton's private residence. Before the knock was answered, the man in the grey suit was in custody, and the dog secured. The man in the grey suit struggled violently, fought like a wild beast, which still further prejudiced the police against him, and was with difficulty handcuffed, manacled, and conveyed to the station house on a stretcher. No one to look at his slight figure would have thought him capable of such savage battling. He asked perpetually for Mr. Broughton, declared that he was not mad, which was strange, as no one had accused him of that failing, and refused to give his name another trait that looked ill. When asked if he had seen Lady Leicester, he denied all knowledge of such a person. The dog had followed him just as any other dog might. As to the road he had come, he was obstinately silent. The police had not waited to waste further inquiries upon him, but hastened to the towers with the news for their chief. His face fell immediately. "I fear," he said, "that Lady Leicester is indeed lost. The dog would never have left her unless. However, we have now got a clue." Mares gave up all hope, yet with his old cool self-possession. Before he started with the superintendent for Barnum, he wrote out a telegram and dispatched it to Theodore, briefly acquainting him with what had happened, and asking him to be especially agreeable to that person, meaning Violet, whose value as a second string to the bow had risen at once. This telegram was dispatched to a dead man. Theodore had been killed the night before in the Sternhold Hall, but in the confusion and the difficulty of at once identifying bodies, no news had been sent to Mares. With the superintendent, Mares went into the cell at the police station, and saw Eimer Mallet handcuffed and manacled. Poor Eimer, indeed. His hair was rough over his forehead, his cheeks stained with blood from a scratch received in the struggle, his whole look wild in the extreme. He saw Mares Basquet, the murderer, the man who had confined him. Is it to be wondered at that he grew excited? He said nothing, but his face worked, and his teeth ground together. Mares looked at him steadily, almost with a smile. In that moment, swift as it passed, he debated upon his best course. Truth, or what he called truth, was the safest, although it would save Eimer's life. "I know this man," he said. "He is a lunatic. He has escaped from my cousin's asylum at Sturmingham. He is very dangerous, without a doubt. This is the guilty party." Eimer denied it. All his efforts were to make people believe that he was not mad. As yet he had no conception of the darker shadow hanging over him. His one idea was, that he had been pursued and captured, that he should be sent back to the asylum. Therefore he had refused to give his name, or to describe the road by which he had come to Barnum. This very mistake increased the suspicion against him of a knowledge of Lady Leicester's disappearance. It will now be understood why Fulk burnt the paper, that Violet might not read it, and why the place was dark and cheerless when they reached it. These events had happened just before they arrived. Mares never lost his presence of mind for a moment, not even when he heard of Theodore's awful death. Turn the mind to the present, was his maxim, Do the best with it you can. His one concern was the disappearance of Violet, still he felt certain that he should be able to trace her. At present, the one thing needful was to crush Eimer Mallet. He held that enemy now in the hollow of his hand, he should taste his finger, as the Orientals say. The magistrates on hearing the evidence at once made out a warrant, and Eimer was remanded, while the search went on for the body, which still eluded all search. Upon the third day, however, some important evidence turned up, and it was thought best to take it in the presence of the prisoner. Eimer was in consequence led into the large apartment used for such purposes at the police station, still wearing the handcuffs, for Mayers had industriously spread the belief that he was a dangerous lunatic. The general public were not admitted, but a few gentlemen were present, and among these was Mr. Broughton, who at once recognized Eimer, rough as his present appearance was, and came forward and spoke to him. Eimer asked him to defend him, and Broughton, to his credit, said he would. To his credit, for his interest in the Leicester estates was large. The magistrate, seeing so respectable a solicitor as Mr. Broughton taking an interest in the prisoner, consulted, and to Mayer's intense disgust offered to allow the prisoner half an hour to confer with his attorney. In that brief period poor Eimer had to relate his confinement and his escape. Broughton listened attentively, then he said, "Your story is strange, almost incredible, still you are in a position where nothing will do you much good but public opinion. My usual advice would be to reserve your defense, my present advice to you is to tell the bench exactly what you have told me, only much more fully. There are no reporters admitted, but I will see that your statement is published. I believe you myself. If the public show any signs of believing you, the prosecutors will withdraw. It is your only chance, for, to be candid, the evidence is terribly against you." They returned to the justice room. The first witness called was the policeman who had detected Eimer and the dog in the street. He described Eimer as walking very fast, and dodging from house to house as if trying to escape notice. This was point number one against him. Then came the evidence as to his furious struggle with the police. One constable could barely make himself understood, a blow straight from the shoulder had knocked a tooth out, and his voice sounded hollow and indistinct. Such a violent resistance obviously indicated a guilty conscience. This was point number two against him. Next it was stated, and stated with perfect truth, that the prisoner had refused to give his name, his place of residence, or any information about himself, and that, finally, he had totally denied even so much as knowing that there was such a person as Lady Leicester. He had tried to conceal his identity in every way, and had deliberately told an untruth, for after living so long at World's End, how could he have failed to know Lady Leicester? This was point number three. Then he gave a very vague, unsatisfactory account of how the dog had followed him. He declared that the dog was a strange dog to him, that he had never seen it before. Now this must be also a willful falsehood. Point number four. But the darkest evidence of all was reserved to the last. There was brought into the room an iron-wit pluff boy, with a shock head of light hair, small eyes, heavy jowl, and low forehead, the very class of witness most to be dreaded, for nothing on earth can make them understand that it is possible for them to be mistaken. The pluff boy, Andrew Hornblow by name, told his story straightforwardly enough. He said that he had been to the Shepherd's Bush that fateful evening, after work, that he had a pint and a half of ale, but was not any the worse for liquor. That at about 7:30, or a little earlier, he left the Shepherd's Bush Inn to return to the farmhouse where he slept. He went across the fields and downs, and his path led him over a section of the park. As he passed a fir copse he heard someone playing on a tin whistle in a most peculiar way. He was curious, to see who it was, and got into the copse. The moment his footsteps were heard the whistle stopped, but pushing aside the boughs, he caught a glimpse of a tallish man, in a grey suit, a dirty grey suit, who seemed anxious to avoid observation, and plunged into the dark recesses of the copse. He didn't think much of it at the time, but it so happened that the spot where he had seen the man was within 100 yards of the pot, and talking of the disappearance of Lady Leicester to his master, the fact had got to the knowledge of the police. Had he seen that man since? Not till he had come into the room, and he pointed at the prisoner, who indeed wore a grey suit, somewhat travel-stained and frayed in places, as if from passage through hedges or woods. Mr. Broughton cross-examined this witness at great length, and with his accustomed shrewdness, but in vain. The Pluff boy was certain the prisoner was the man. All that could be got from him was, that he had not distinctly seen the face of the man in the copse, but he was tallish, and wore a dirty grey suit. This established the fact that the prisoner was near about the spot, where Lady Leicester had disappeared, somewhere within half an hour of that mysterious event. Point number 6 was still more convincing. Upon the prisoner being searched, there was found upon him a tin whistle. The whistle was produced, and was of a peculiar construction. When blown, it gave a singular sound, more musical than the ordinary whistle. It was covered with sketches apparently engraved with a sharp tool of dogs, some of them very spirited and faithful outline representations. It was well known that the prisoner was a good draughtsman. The only point that remained to be established was the death of Lady Leicester. The body had not been found. Upon this evidence the police very properly asked for a remand till the body was discovered. Mr. Broughton immediately applied for bail. The bench asked upon what grounds, and this gave Eimer an opportunity to tell his tale. Remember, that all this time Mayor Basket was sitting side by side with the magistrates, who naturally felt for his position, and treated him with exceptional courtesy. When Eimer began, Mayers objected on the ground that the prisoner was a lunatic escaped from Sturmingham Asylum, and that these wild statements, if they got into print, would do him harm. The bench assured him that nothing the prisoner, whose wild appearance proved the condition of his mind, could say would prejudice him in their estimation, and as there were no reporters present, nothing could get abroad. It was better to let the prisoner tell his tale. He might inadvertently disclose the fate of poor Lady Leicester. It was true that the prisoner, being a lunatic, would escape the extreme penalty of the law, but it was very desirable to learn all that could be known of poor Lady Agnes. Mayers had to be satisfied, and to listen while Eimer, in clear, forcible language, told his story, hinting broadly at Mayer's complicity in the death of Jason Waldron, and describing the manner in which he had been trapped, and his escape. The bench listened with an incredulous air, as well they might. The man was evidently mad, quite mad. Finally, Eimer came to his arrival at Belthrop late in the afternoon of the day after he had got out of the asylum. Finding Violet was not at Hannah Bond's, and greatly alarmed, he was at a loss what to do. To go back to Sturmingham was extremely dangerous for fear of recapture, and he hesitated for a while. At last, after partaking of refreshment given to him by old Hannah, he had started for Barnum with the intention of calling on Mr. Broughton and taking his advice. Halfway to Barnum it had occurred to him that perhaps Violet after all was at the Towers, and he diverged from his course and approached the mansion, as he supposed, about 1 in the morning. He saw a number of people about and in commotion, and afraid of being recognized and captured, altered his mind again, and turned to go to Barnum across the downs. In doing so he admitted that he had passed near the pot, but not at the time stated by the Pluff boy, 7:30 in the evening, but 1:30 in the morning. As he walked through the grass he saw something glistening, and picked up the tin whistle found upon him. He should not have taken the trouble to carry it away had it not been for the curious figures on it, which, being a light night, he could just distinguish. As he came up the side of the downs, just as he passed the Giant's Ring, i.e., a circle of stones set on edge some ancient monument, he was overtaken by the dog Dando, who jumped and fawned upon him with delight as an old friend, and followed him to Barnum, where he was captured by the police. He had resisted them because he thought they were under orders to return him to the asylum. The dog Dando limped a little, and he had noticed that his back showed signs of a severe recent beating. Hannah Bond could prove that he did not leave Belthrop till nearly or quite 8, and it was impossible for him to get to the pot, 10 miles, in less than 3 hours, across a rough country. His dress was dirty and torn because he had walked quite 20 miles when arrested, and passed through several coppices. Upon this Mr. Broughton asked for bail, and offered himself in any sum they might name. But the bench could not get over the fact of the asylum. The prisoner was a dangerous lunatic. Even if his story was true, he was a lunatic. No, the prisoner was removed to his cell pending the discovery of the body of Lady Leicester. All that Broughton could do was to order his carriage and set out for Belthrop to find Hannah Bond. Poor Eimer. It was Violet he thought of still. But events press so quickly, it is impossible to pause and analyze his emotion. The next day about noon, Mr. Broughton came into the cell with a grave look upon his face, and carrying a large parcel in his hand. Eimer begged him to tell him the truth at once. Mr. Broughton told him that first the body of Lady Leicester had been found. A more careful search by boat near the pot had discovered it. Instead of being carried down by the current, an eddy at the cave had thrown it up against the course of the stream a few yards, and lodged it behind a boulder. There were no marks of violence, she had simply been drowned. Secondly, he had been to Belthrop, and found Hannah Bond's cottage shut up, the old lady gone, and not a trace of her to be found, though he had searched the villages for miles round. Thirdly, the book parcel in his hand had been to London to Eimer's address there, and had been returned to him, Eimer having left instructions that his letters should be sent to Mr. Broughton. Upon removing the outer wrapper, there was the name and address of Eimer Mallet, Esq., written in the handwriting of the dead Lady Leicester. 14. Fulk had a difficult game to play. In the first place, his motions were restricted by the dread of Maerst's emissaries. He could only go out at night. He wished to preserve Violet from a knowledge of Eimer's misfortune, and yet to go to work himself to release his friend. The first thing to do was to get Hannah Bond to the place, for clearly Violet could not remain there alone with him. Knowing the country well, he had no difficulty on the night after their arrival, the very night after the preliminary examination of Eimer Mallet, in finding his way to Belthrop. He explained the circumstances to Hannah, who at once packed up a few things, and walked back with him over the downs to the place, without awakening one of her neighbors. This was how Hannah Bond disappeared. Fulk's knowledge of the circumstances under which Eimer had been arrested was very meager, but on the third day the Barnum Chronicle came out, and Hannah got him a copy. In it was a full, almost verbatim, account of the preliminary examination, furnished, in fact, by Mr. Broughton. Over this paper Fulk spent the greater part of the night thinking. He shut himself up in a room at the place on the pretence that he had letters to write, and studied the report, line for line and word for word. After an hour or two, his eye became irresistibly attracted by a little paragraph in small type, evidently added at the last moment before going to press. It was but a few lines, announcing that the dog Dando had again disappeared from the towers. He had been chained up carefully as was supposed, but he had gone in the night. This little paragraph fixed Fulk's attention. He tried to follow the dog's motions. Why, when Lady Leicester fell down the pot, did not the dog return to the towers? Why did he turn up at the Giant's Ring, with a limp in one leg, as if from a kick, and his back bearing marks of a severe beating? How came that odd and peculiar whistle in the grass? How came there to be two men in grey, one at 7:30, the other at 1:30? The Pluff boy had heard a peculiar whistling. By degrees the conviction forced itself into his mind that the other than in grey, the 7:30 man, must have been no other than his cousin Odo. All the facts answered to such a theory. A tallish man, playing upon a tin whistle, the dog was of the very breed that Odo had such a fancy for. The beating, doubtless the dog had been attracted by Odo, but had refused to obey him, and had been kicked and thrashed till he ran off, and crossed Eimer's path. The Giant's Ring had actually been one of Odo's favorite haunts before he was confined. It was a wild and desolate spot. Fulk saw it all now clearly. Obviously Odo was still lingering about, perhaps trying to find the whistle he had dropped. Obviously Odo had stolen the dog Dando from the towers a second time. If he could find Dando, he could find Odo, and Odo found, then Ymer's release was a matter of time only. Fulk meditated, and at last resolved upon his course. He would visit the haunts which he knew Odo used to favor. But Odo was a strong and powerful man, endowed with singular physical strength. Fulk was little, and by no means strong. Art must conquer nature. Fulk prepared a cord with a noose, the use of which he had learnt years and years before in a trip to South America. It was a lasso, in fact. Then followed an anxious time. Violet grew more and more restless. Although the place was so retired, yet people began to know that it was again inhabited. Fulk had heard of strangers being seen about, and he at once guessed that Mares had his spies searching for Ymer Mallet's companion in the escape. Every night he went out upon his strange errand, hunting the wild man of the woods. Meantime, an inquest was held upon poor Lady Leicester, and a verdict of murder returned against Ymer Mallet. Days and nights passed, and hunt and search how he would, still Odo eluded him. It was a warm, beautiful evening. The same lucent planet that had so often shone upon Lady Leicester during her visit to the fatal pot, glittered in the western sky, but its beams were somewhat dimmed by the new moon, whose crescent was on the point of disappearing below the horizon. Fulk, pushing slowly and sadly through the woods and copses, inhaled the fragrance of the pine tree. The rabbits scattered at his approach. Now and then a wood pigeon rose into the air, with a tremendous clatter. In the open it was still light, under the trees a dusky shadow brooded. At a distance, he could faintly hear the sound of rushing water, and the fidgety chirping of the restless brook sparrows and sedge warblers. Suddenly there rose a shrill, piping sound, and Fulk started, and his heart for a moment stood still. He listened. Then came a strange weird music, if music it could be called, for in its indescribable cadences it reminded him of the playing of the savages in far-off shores, visited years ago. But he recognized it in an instant. He had heard Odo play similar notes when they were boys. Gently, gently, he crept through the brushwood, and holding a branch aside, looked down from the bank upon the stream. It rushed along swiftly with a murmuring sound, reflecting upon its surface the image of the bright planet. The sedges and reeds rustled in the light breeze, and there was Odo. Across the stream there was a fallen tree, the very tree Odo had loved in his youth, and astride upon that tree sat the beast man, his feet nearly touching the water, playing upon a tin whistle. Before him was the dog Dando, standing on his hind legs, and moving in grotesque time to the music. Odo reproached the dog, and told him that he was an unworthy son of his father, and could not dance half so well. Had he already forgotten his beating? But perhaps it was the fault of his whistle. Ah, he had lost his best whistle, the one he had made with selected tin, and ornamented with pictures of his dogs, among them Dando's father, who danced so much better. Then he muttered incoherent, half-articulate sounds to the dog, sighed deeply, and began to play again. Poor Odo! Fulk hesitated. There was a large soul in his little body. He pitied the poor fellow before him from the bottom of his heart. All that singular being wanted was the open air, and freedom to play his tin whistle, fondle his dogs, roam in the woods, and tinker up pots and kettles. Had he been permitted to follow these inclinations, it was doubtful if he would ever have committed crime, but civilization would not permit it. For a whole year he had been roaming from wood to wood, from wilderness to wilderness, whistling, tinkering sometimes, always happy in simple freedom. Probably he had destroyed Lady Agnes to obtain the dog, the progenitor of which appeared to have been a favorite in old times. But Fulk reflected that, while he hesitated, Ymer languished in the cell, Violet was wearing her heart out, and his own liberty was endangered. Moreover, there was a duty to society. Such beings must not go wholly at large, or no one would be safe. The lasso hissed through the air, the noose dropped round Odo's neck, and was drawn tight in an instant. It had taken his neck and one shoulder. He roared aloud with pain and anger, but the cord choked him. His arms struck out, but he had nothing to grasp. He was dragged on shore in a moment. He floundered, leapt up, and fell again, tearing at the rope like a wild beast taken in the toils. With a swift, dexterous turn of the hand, Fulk wound the cord about his arms and legs, much as a spider might its web about a fly, till Odo lay panting on the sward, helpless, but still hoarsely murmuring and grunting. Then Fulk loosened the lasso round his neck, and proceeded to tie the limbs tighter, finally binding him hard and fast to a tree. Odo's frame quivered, and Fulk, in the dim light, fancied that great tears gathered in his eyes. After binding Odo, there was still a piece of the rope left. With this Fulk secured the dog, which, frightened and astonished, had cowered on the earth. Dando evidently had no affection for Odo, he had been wiled away by gypsy arts only. Then, leading Dando, Fulk set off at a run, tearing through wood and hedge, mounting the steep downs, fast as his strength could carry him, away for Barnum Town. At that very time, late into the night, Mr. Broughton was conferring with the prisoner in his cell. He had been sent for in haste, and went quickly fearing lest Eimer should be ill. The parcel addressed to Eimer Mallet in Lady Leicester's handwriting was a large antique Bible, which Eimer recognized in a moment as having belonged to old Jenkins, the gardener at the place. He had seen it lying about, but had taken no notice of it. It was in fact the very Bible Lady Agnes had purchased of the gardener's wife when left in destitution by her husband's imprisonment. Inside the Bible was a short formal note, dated the very day in the evening of which Lady Agnes was drowned, stating that the writer when she bought the book was unaware to whom it had belonged, and therefore returned it to Eimer's address, not knowing Violet's, as she desired to retain nothing of theirs. She added that she would return the dog Dando if they would receive it, and tell her where to send it. Eimer, having no occupation in his cell but melancholy thoughts and anxious cares about Violet, naturally turned over the leaves of the noble old book, and looking at it closer than before he found at the end, upon one of the spare leaves, a curious inscription which purported to be a copy from a tomb. It was in Latin, English, and Greek, a strange, fantastic mixture, and when translated, read to the effect that Arthur Sibold Waldron, whilom of Wolfsglow, born Sibold, afterwards Sibold Waldron, was married at St. S. Church, Middlesex, and was buried at Penge in Kent, with dates, and the usual sentiments. The entry in the Bible simply added, "Copy of ye inscription, now defaced. MEM. To have the same recut. BW." Here was the clue Eimer had searched for in vain, thrown into his hands, by the operation of those strange and mysterious circumstances over which no one has any control. He sent for Mr. Broughton, and so it was that when Fulk found that gentleman it was in the cell. The surprise of Eimer, and his pleasure at seeing Fulk, his still greater joy and relief when Fulk in his first sentence announced that Violet was safe, can easily be imagined. Mr. Broughton had no sooner heard Fulk's explanation than he at once comprehended the importance of securing Odo. He and Fulk with 2 assistants drove as near the wood as practicable, and after much trouble safely lodged the unfortunate lunatic in the hands of the police. Fulk remained with Broughton, who very considerately went in his carriage in the morning over to the place, and brought Violet and Hannah Bond to his own private residence in Barnum. At the inquiry that followed, the first step was the release of Eimer on bail, on the testimony of Hannah Bond, that he had not left the cottage at Belthrop till 8 o'clock. The Plough boy, when shown Odo, at once declared that this was the man he had seen, had such mortal big ears a-minded that, now. And Mares? His position became extremely awkward. It was easy to declare that Eimer was a lunatic, but when Fulk was produced, when the clever escape was related in exactly the same manner by both, when Fulk added what he had overheard about the murder of Jason Waldron, Mares could not but notice that the magistrates and the court looked coldly upon him. He claimed them both as escaped lunatics. Said the bench, "We don't see what right you have to them. The owner of the asylum is dead. We will take it upon ourselves to say, that the lunatics, for lunatics, have a remarkably sane way of talking." The result was, that Mares withdrew. The more he meddled with the matter, the worse it became for him. To add to the evil complexion of affairs, Odo confessed in his cell to the murder of Jason Waldron. He strenuously denied having touched Lady Agnes. He declared that his sole object was the dog. The dog was the descendant of an old favourite, and he had once followed Miss Merton to Torquay to get it. But as he stole round from behind the oak trunk to seize the dog, Lady Agnes saw him, started, missed her footing, and fell down the pot. He knew her, she was his cousin, and he had no feeling against her. In all probability the story was true, as no marks of violence were found on the body. But he frankly confessed hitting Jason Waldron on the head with the billhook, and stated exactly what Fulk had already said that he was told by Theodore Mayers: if he killed that man, and his daughter, Eimer shuddered, he should be always free. He had laid in wait for the daughter, but she was out of his reach at the Towers. Odo concluded with a cunning wink, and called Mr. Broughton to come near. He whispered to him that he should be the richest man in the world if he would give him liberty. Broughton humoured the miserable creature, and told the rest to leave the cell. Then Odo disclosed his bribe. He said that years ago the gypsies with whom he consorted had shown him a deed, to which they attached a species of superstitious reverence, and asked him to read it, it being in law characters, and in Latin. It was a deed conferring an entail upon the estate at Wolfsglow, the very estate, whispered Odo, that all the people are trying for. Odo ascertained that this deed had been stolen by Romy Basket's elder brother, the man who, with his mother, left the swamp when old Will Basket was shot, stolen with the intention of injuring the Sibolds, his father's murderers. He had watched old Sibold poring over this deed, therefore thought it valuable, seized his opportunity, and stole it. With the strangest, maddest mixture of shrewdness and lunacy, Odo in his turn stole the deed from the gypsies who had preserved it, and held it, to be used as a bribe in case he should be captured. He now offered it to Broughton, if Broughton would only let him go free. The lawyer must be forgiven if he told a falsehood, and promised. Odo told him where the deed was hidden, and, as he had described, so they found it. In that tree which had fallen across the stream where he had used to sit astride and whistle, halfway across was a knot. This knot with his tools he had cut out excavated a cavity, and used the knot to hide it, so that the closest inspection must have failed to find it. They found the tree and the knot. They got the knot out, there was a small tin box, Odo's own workmanship, and in the box was the long-lost deed. Poor Odo of course never got his freedom, but there were friends who saw that he was as well cared for as under the circumstances was possible. Who could harbour revenge against such a creature? He was but the instrument in the hands of others, and not truly guilty of poor Jason's death. That lay at the door of Mayers and Theodore. Theodore was dead. Morally speaking, Volkslo Mayers. He wrote a full account of what he had overheard, and it was published in a great London paper. The asylum was searched, and the holes in the wall found as described. By this letter Fulk secured two objects: first, his own liberty in future, for popular opinion rose with irresistible violence in his favour; secondly, he destroyed Mayers. Yet it was not the murder of Jason Waldron which did it, it was the Lucca. There were people who had lost heavily over the Lucca. These people pursued Mayers Basket, threatened him with criminal, civil, and every kind of proceedings. He fled, escaping arrest by a few hours only, taking with him £5,000 in gold. He is believed to have reached California, but has not been heard of since. Whether the nemesis of these modern days, circumstances over which we have no control, engulfed him in still deadlier ruin, was never known. His fall, as it was great indeed. By the death of Lady Agnes Leicester, Fulk succeeded to her estates, which, added to those already his, made him one of the largest landholders in the county. If he survives Odo, he will be a still more wealthy man. He never left Eimer's side till all was well. Eimer and Violet were married in the autumn, married in the quietest manner, and, aided pecuniarily by Fulk, left for the south of France, there to try and efface the memory of the awful event that had embittered the path of their love. Fulk joined them with a yacht 2 months later on. They are very, very happy, but it is in a subdued and quiet manner. It is hardly possible for them yet, even in the sunny south, to feel so abundantly joyous as would be natural to their youth. But as the time rolls on they will gradually supplant the old unhappy memories with fresh and pleasant pictures. The last letter from Fulk announced that the sea breezes and the fresh air had begun to work wonders with his complexion, and that he hoped ere long to throw off the horrid yellow produced by his confinement, and resume his proper color. That was natural in Fulk. The proverb says that little men are often conceited. Yellow or rosy, or brown, he will always be the dearest friend of Eimer and Violet. And the great estate the city of Sturmingham. To this very hour that Gordian knot remains untied, to this very hour claimants every now and then startle the world with extraordinary statements, and the companies having nothing else to do, have fallen to loggerheads between themselves, and spend their vast incomes in litigation. But aided by Fulk's money, and the influence his family connections possessed, Violet did at last receive a portion of her rights. The chain of evidence proving her descent from Arthur Sibold was completed down to the smallest link. The corporation of Sturmingham, after much law and talk, were finally compelled to acknowledge her claim. By arbitration it was settled that they were to pay her £8,000 per annum for 10 years, and at the expiration of that period, £10,000 per annum to herself and heirs, in perpetual ground rent. The companies still hold out, but it is only as to the amount they shall contribute in the same way, and they will have to come to terms. Violet will thus receive a large income without compromising her rights, which are specially reserved. She has not forgotten poor Jenkins, whose Bible gave the clue to the register of Arthur Sibold's marriage. The old man is at last recompensed for his long suffering. The imprisonment expired in due time. He and his wife live in the old cottage at the place, tending the gardens as of yore, being made comfortable with an ample provision from Violet. Violet and Eimer once a year visit the place and the tomb of poor Jason. They have taken a mansion at Tunbridge Wells, but spend much time in Eimer's beloved Florence, with Fulk. They love the old house, and yet they do not care to live where everything recalls such gloomy memories as at the place. Colophon. World's End. Was published in 1877 by Richard Jefferies. This ebook was produced for Standard eBooks by Brian Evans, and is based on a transcription produced in 2011 by an anonymous volunteer for Project Gutenberg, and on digital scans from the Internet Archive. The cover page is adapted from Broadway from the Post Office. A painting completed in 1906 by Colin Campbell Cooper. The cover and title pages feature the League Spartan and Sorts Mill Gaudi. Typefaces created in 2014 and 2009 by the League of Movable Type. This edition was released on April 9, 2024, 4:08 p.m. and is based on Revision 8D0F0CB. The first edition of this ebook was released on March 15, 2024, 6:45 p.m. You can check for updates to this ebook, view its revision history, or download it for different e-reading systems at standardebooks.org/ebook/Richard-Jefferies/worlds-end. The volunteer-driven Standard eBooks project relies on readers like you to submit typos, corrections, and other improvements. Anyone can contribute at standardebooks.org. Imprint. This ebook is the product of many hours of hard work by volunteers for Standard eBooks, and builds on the hard work of other literature lovers made possible by the public domain. This particular ebook is based on a transcription from Project Gutenberg and on digital scans from the Internet Archive. The source text and artwork in this ebook are believed to be in the United States public domain, that is, they are believed to be free of copyright restrictions in the United States. They may still be copyrighted in other countries, so users located outside of the United States must check their local laws before using this ebook. The creators of, and contributors to, this ebook dedicate their contributions to the worldwide public domain via the terms in the CC 01.0 Universal Public Domain Dedication. For full license information, see the uncopyright at the end of this ebook. Standard eBooks is a volunteer-driven project that produces ebook editions of public domain literature using modern typography, technology, and editorial standards, and distributes them free of cost. You can download this and other ebooks carefully produced for true book lovers at standardebooks.org. World's End. By Richard Jefferies. Uncopyright. May you do good and not evil. May you find forgiveness for yourself and forgive others. May you share freely, never taking more than you give. Copyright pages exist to tell you that you can't do something. Unlike them, this uncopyright page exists to tell you that the writing and artwork in this ebook are believed to be in the United States public domain, that is, they are believed to be free of copyright restrictions in the United States. The United States public domain represents our collective cultural heritage, and items in it are free for anyone in the United States to do almost anything at all with, without having to get permission. Copyright laws are different all over the world, and the source text or artwork in this ebook may still be copyrighted in other countries. If you're not located in the United States, you must check your local laws before using this ebook. Standard eBooks makes no representations regarding the copyright status of the source text or artwork in this ebook in any country other than the United States. Non-authorship activities performed on items that are in the public domain, so-called sweat of the brow work, don't create a new copyright. That means that nobody can claim a new copyright on an item that is in the public domain for, among other things, work like digitization, markup, or typography. Regardless, the contributors to this ebook release their contributions under the terms in the CC 01.0 Universal Public Domain Dedication, thus dedicating to the worldwide public domain all of the work they've done on this ebook, including but not limited to metadata, the title page, imprint, colophon, this uncopyright, and any changes or enhancements to, or markup on, the original text and artwork. This dedication doesn't change the copyright status of the source text or artwork. We make this dedication in the interest of enriching our global cultural heritage, to promote free and libre culture around the world, and to give back to the unrestricted culture that has given all of us so much. Table of Contents. Title page. Imprint. Book I. Facts. I. 2. 3. 4. V. 6. 7. 8. 9. X. 11. 12. 13. 14. 15. Book 2, Persons. I. 2. 3. 4. V. 6. 7. 8. 9. X. 11. 12. 13. 14. 15. Book 3, Results. I. 2. 3. 4. V. 6. 7. 8. 9. X. 11. 12. 13. 14. Colophon. Uncopyright. Landmarks. World's End.